So that is my upstairs neighbor on the piano, and this is a video response to um, Too Many Minds, who posted another helpful volley of um, critiques and concerns that I think are helpful because he's really asking me to clarify my concepts and communicate myself a little bit more effectively. So I'm going to try to do that really by amplifying some of the things that Too Many Minds was saying. He seemed to be willing to grant that I was at least moving theology in the right direction by, as he put it, recognizing that the old guy can't be at the top of things as some kind of a transcendent designer, but rather needs to be wedged in the middle so that we're doing theology, in other words, in the context of cosmology, and biology, and the natural sciences, as well as the human sciences, I would add, um, rather than doing a kind of irrelevant theology that would seek a transcendent beyond, a God that is not of this world. I am probably just as adamantly dismissive of those sorts of other worldly theologies as Too Many Minds is, and many other people who call themselves atheists on YouTube. I think that that sort of theology is really irrelevant, and not only irrelevant, it does harm to our ability to actively engage one another politically and artistically, here and now in the individual and collective lives that we lead. We need a metaphysical basis for our civilization, a theological basis for our civilized activities, and a religion that promises people pearly gates after death, so long as they agree to the rules in this book, or the rules pontificated from the pulpit. They'll be able to pass through. That sort of a religion leads to jingoistic, nationalistic, evangelical fundamentalism, like we see in the middle of the United States, and the South, and that we see in some of the Middle Eastern collectives and nations. So we want to avoid that kind of otherworldly theology that would pretend to judge this world from beyond this world. That approach is reprehensible, I feel, and I would be willing to speak against it passionately, and have. For example, check out some of my videos to Venom Fang X, a well-known Christian here on YouTube. Um, so yes, theology needs to be immanent. It needs to be concerned with our daily lives. It needs to be politically engaged on behalf of the marginalized, not the rich, as it sometimes is, but on behalf of the marginalized, on behalf of the outsider, the other, um, uh, and so on. It needs to work on behalf of social justice, much like, say, liberation theology, um, um, Leonardo Boff, and others. Usually, this movement, I think, is strongest in South America. Uh, Other liberation theologians would be Matthew Fox, for example. I think uh, those are two theologians to look to, I think, for an example of what I would hope for theology in the future. Matthew Fox and Leonardo Boff. I'll post some links to those guys' ideas in the description. Um, so what more can I say then about a cosmotheology or a theology of this world? Well, it's going to have to incorporate the findings of modern science, in particular evolutionary theory, or at least I'm going to choose evolution as one theory that um, needs to be incorporated into any theological reflection. Now, I want to generalize evolution so that it isn't just Darwin's specialized theory that applies only to already organized, self-organizing animals, individuals, and that through natural selection and mutation is able to generate what he calls evolution. I want to talk about a more general theory of evolution that could apply to the cosmos as a whole. Um, and I think, following thinkers like Alfred North Whitehead and Henri Bergson and more recently Isabel Stengers and the chemist Ilya Prigogine. Stengers was Prigogine's laboratory assistant at one time, so she's also a chemist. Bruno Latour, as I've mentioned, the sociologist of science, and increasingly the speculative philosopher, they articulate a sort of cosmological backdrop to the human project where we're involved in this 13.7 year evolutionary adventure, and unlike the sort of mechanistic atomism that we had prior to the 20th century revolutions in physics, where the smallest components of the universe, what the stuff of which the universe was really made, namely atoms, they were thought to be sort of created at the beginning with the universe and to eternally persist from there on out, while obeying the transcendently. I want to make sure we never confuse transcendental with transcendent, but that's another issue entirely. Transcendently imposed laws. Now we know in modern evolutionary cosmology that laws really can't be thought of as transcendently imposed. They're more like cosmic habits. And we know that atoms, the atoms that we know, that the various elements that make up this small percentage of the universe that we know as normal matter, they emerged in time, right? Just like biological organisms. There's, at the physical level, this gradual process of complexification where, let's say if we go back as far to the Big Bang singularity moment that we can and talk about the first particles that emerged, electrons and protons, let's say, and there's subatomic quark and other activity going on even below this level. But let's just start with the proton and the electron. They sort of co-evolve with one another, and eventually there emerges hydrogen atoms and a few helium atoms, and photons are released from that new emergence of complex self-organizing identity called the atom. And then eventually atoms self-organized into giant stars, and stars self-organized, and other atoms self-organized into giant, even larger galaxies, highly ordered spiral galaxies that themselves were generated by and sort of kept at equilibrium in terms of the amount of stars that were being created by these supermassive black holes at the center. So you get this sort of nucleated organismic structure, 13 billion years ago, when we're only dealing with supposedly non-living clouds of hydrogen and stars, right? But the picture I'm trying to paint here is that there's been an evolutionary process of complexification that seems rather organic when you look at it, and I think when we try to understand what the human being is in all of this, we have to recognize that certainly consciousness didn't originate with us. So part of that old otherworldly theology was that the human soul really wasn't of this world and was unlike the experience of any other creature, non-human creature on this planet. And so what evolution shows us is our connection not only to the other creatures on the planet, but like to the first galaxies, to the stars. That not only our bodies, but our to the extent that we have them, our souls though this is a different understanding of the soul than the traditional pre-evolutionary understanding, certainly. But our bodies and our souls are related to these ancient stars who, in their death, going supernova, created the heavier elements that allowed our more complex form of conscious experience to exist. So part of what theology needs to do in this new scientific context, especially in this evolutionary context, is understand the human being not just as an ego or some kind of a rational agent that you know uh, makes deliberate decisions and so on. All of that's important for civilization and stuff, of course, but that's the mere the very tip of the iceberg, right? To use the Freudian metaphor, with the large mass of our psyche existing below the surface of this egoic consciousness. And so we need a kind of, any cosmotheology is going to be a theology that is concerned not just with that sense of presence, egoic presence that Too Many Minds was talking about, but we need a theology willing to dwell on the fringes of experience, on the horizons of consciousness, and to sort of create ecstasy and experiences of ecstasy for the ego through the sort of theopoetic discourse that the theologian is able to articulate, so that the ego is able to transcend itself, not by reaching a transcendent God, but by actually participating in the flow of cosmic energy, billions and billions of years old, that we have emerged amidst. So we need a process theology, right? And there have been plenty of thinkers before me who have done a far more complete and eloquent articulation of what a process theology might look like. There's Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist who I've mentioned. There's Alfred North Whitehead, of course. There's Henri Bergson. There's so many others. I'll post some links. I guess one last thing before I wrap this up. Too Many Minds mentioned Robert Sapolsky, the behavioral anthropologist, I guess you might call him, or I'm not sure what his title is. I'm not that familiar with his work. I watched a little bit of one of the videos that Too Many Minds sent me about his biological understanding of human religion and human social behaviors and so on, and ethics. And I'd have to watch more to really comment with any authority, but I can, after the little bit that I've looked at, I think this sort of a biological reductionism of culture, which seems to be what he's attempting, I think we need to be careful when we, for example, try to account for life in terms of these three things: self-preservation, sex, and greed. And why is this an oversimplification? Well, because let's start with greed. You can make the claim as a late capitalist sort of white scientist working in an American university that it is human nature to be greedy. On the other hand, you could sort of really examine ethnology and anthropology and realize that greed is more of a cultural value that has emerged in Western capitalist societies, but there are plenty of examples of non-capitalist forms of social organization that practice potlatch and have gift economies and so on, where greed isn't really uh, such a force, or a social power. Rather, generosity becomes an expression of social power. So we can cross greed off the list pretty easily. I think that's clearly a cultural bias to assume that that it is human nature to be greedy. As far as self-preservation goes, I think to the extent that a body is alive, it's alive because of a certain self-organizing dynamic that is continually unfolding. That needs to take in energy through food and release it, and so it is, it's an entropy. We are an entropy-producing, self-organizing uh, um, entity that does, in some sense, seek its own preservation. Um, on the other hand, part of our self-preservation, not just as humans, I don't think humans are the only social animal or the only political animal. I think almost every species of animal um, has a social sort of milieu within which its life unfolds. Um, no animal exists as just an individual. So while there's self-preservation of my own body, every organism also has a sense of social preservation. Um, what may be unique about the human and our capacity for social preservation is that, unlike other species, most other species at least, maybe dolphins accepted, we can expand our ethical horizon to include not only members of our own species, um, but we can include other species as well. Um, I mentioned dolphins just because I've heard of them saving dogs and saving humans from drowning and so on. So, interesting, interesting case there. Um, so yeah, self-preservation can also sort of be put in a more complex context, so that it isn't as uh, it doesn't this is self-preservation and greed as these two fundamental aspects of human nature, is a very sort of capitalist. It's assuming that we have always been capitalist and that human nature is necessarily greedy and acquisitive and um, selfish. I don't think that's really the case across the board when you look at the ethnographic data outside of the West. So what's left then is sex, and certainly sexual desire is a major part of life. Um, but just like this issue of preservation that isn't merely inward focused but social, sex is sort of it's almost like a wound that um, cuts off each individual member of the species from its opposite sex, another individual. So as individuals, as individual males or females, we exist in this torn state, a wounded state, that a state that we only can begin to heal through copulation, through the sexual act, and through love and everything that surrounds that kind of activity. Um, so certainly sex is an important one, but when we start to ask like what is sex and why does it drive us? Why does it drive us? We can be Freudian about this and sort of reduce everything to the sexual libido, but sex itself seems to be the expression of a more generalized form of eros, eroticism, or desire. And there are other desires that you could call sexual in the sense that they're seeking a wholeness that feels lost, or they're the desire to participate in something beyond oneself, and in that way to reconnect with what one really is. In many ways, I think both the religious and the artistic and the scientific um, disciplines, these activities, cultural activities that humans engage in, are the result of a kind of desire. a desire not just for sexual conception, but for epistemic conception, for intellectual conception, and for aesthetic conception, um, and for their higher desires, you could say. Um, so when we talk about sex as the sort of essence of life, we need to include not only physical sexuality. We need to recognize that there's actually something profound going on in the sexual relation, um, that allows us to participate in forms of self-transcendence, and that the erotic may very well be the source of all art, religion, and ultimately science as well. Uh, so I think I'll post a few other things, essays I've written that fill in the blanks and provide the background for some of the assertions I'm making here. Um, and I realize that I have maybe an orthodox way of thinking, and it's not always clear and logical and deductive. My arguments are they follow more of a logic of imagination than a deductive logic. So a logic of imagination kind of dances, which is a metaphor I've used before. It's oscillatory. It hovers between opposites. So in that sense, it can't be objective or you know because there's no foundation in a logic of imagination for us to stand on and attempt to represent the way things are objectively. We're too wrapped up in the ongoing adventure of cosmogenesis to try to stand outside the flow of this river and watch it go by and passively, dispassionately describe it. So I don't ever really try to do that. My philosophizing takes place sort of, in media res, right, in the middle of things. So hopefully you didn't drown in it. But thanks for listening if you made it this far.